And we're hearing from Mr. Horrell in relation to a summary statement was 42A, and we're on page 9, I think, of your summary statement.
That's right, yes. Paragraph
51.
Okay. So policy RUS P6, reverse sensitivity. Mr. Matthews for Genesis Energy has sought that policy GRUS P6 is amended to avoid the establishment of new sensitive activities near any existing, in quotation marks, activities that have a functional need or operational need to be located in the general rural zone. This is in addition to the activities that have been specifically listed in the current policy. I consider that this change would significantly broaden the direction. I note that there are various activities that have a functional need or operational need to be located in the general rural zone, and most of which are not subject to potential reverse sensitivity effects. For instance, residential activities have a functional and operational need to be located in the general rural zone. Mr. Enzor for Fulton Hogan has sought that clause B of policy GRUS P6 is amended, as amended in my section 42A report, is split into a separate policy. Mr. Enzor considers that the second part of the policy does not relate to reverse sensitivity and therefore should be split to avoid confusion. As acknowledged in my section 42A, the second part of this policy does not directly relate to reverse sensitivity. I consider that the policy continues to work well together, given both parts relate to managing conflicts with activities in the general rural zone. But I do agree that the title of the policy is misleading. To clarify this, I recommend a change to the title to be managing potential conflicts, and that would be as opposed to reverse sensitivity. Moving into part 1, key issue 6, general rural zone rules, and starting with seasonal worker accommodation. Mr. Hodgson for Horticulture New Zealand and New Zealand Pork Industry Board has sought changes to the rules for seasonal worker accommodation to allow for more than one seasonal worker accommodation building, subject to a cumulative gross floor area of all buildings not exceeding 150 square metres, and to allow for seasonal worker accommodation over highly productive land. In support of relying on primarily a cumulative ground floor area, Mr. Hodgson has provided examples of this approach being adopted in other districts. With relation to the highly productive land, Mr. Hodgson has provided further evidence to suggest that allowing for seasonal worker accommodation over highly productive land remains consistent with the MPS for highly productive land. Specifically, Mr. Hodgson has indicated that seasonal worker accommodation is anticipated by clause 3.9 of the MPS as a supporting activity. I agree with Mr. Hodgson on both changes sought. I consider that the cumulative gross floor area will continue to manage the scale of the activity while providing for circumstances where there's more than one unit. I agree that seasonal worker accommodation is an anticipated activity through clause 3.9 of the MPS, and consider that the changes of the permitted rule will minimise any potential loss of highly productive land. I've recommended changes to GRUS R4 in line with Mr. Hodgson with what he's proposed.
Can you just take us to those changes?
Those changes?
Page 32. I've just got a quick and the maximum cumulative gross area. I think you just need to change it so it's accommodation buildings are no more than 150.
Yes. Yes, that's
that covers that
account for more.
Style. Yeah.
Yes. Agree. I'll update that. So that's on page 32. So the main changes is to remove clause C from the permitted rule, which is no more than one seasonal worker accommodation building, and also to remove the restriction over highly productive land of the Martinborough Soils overlay. That also removes the controlled status that aligned with that. And so now it would have the permitted rule up to a cumulative gross floor area of 150 square metres. Where that's not met, it would go to a restricted discretionary activity.
And was that the intention that 150 was a cumulative rule as opposed to individual?
It was not. Initially, the intent was, or the understanding was, that worker accommodation would typically be within one unit, and to minimise those effects, we've required one unit. Mr. Hodgson has provided evidence that in various circumstances, there's actually a number of small buildings that can have the same effect, but the cumulative floor area continues to meet the intent.
Okay.
I thought that was a really good change.
Okay.
So where am I?
It takes you to
Residential visitor
okay.
accommodation.
Just before you get into that, what's the difference between residential visitor accommodation and visitor accommodation?
So residential visitor accommodation must primarily occur within a residential unit. And there is an associated definition that I think was talked to in here in stream 2 or maybe 1. But effectively it has a limit on the number of days that it can be have a guest in, and the main mitigating factor is it has to be within an existing residential dwelling.
Okay. Whereas visitor accommodation can be a bespoke offering.
That's right.
Building, and presumably not subject to limitations on duration, etc.
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
So I guess to clarify, with residential visitor accommodation, that would not include any hotel, motel, anything like that. It would be, say, a bed and breakfast.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
So Mr. Hodgson, for both Horticulture New Zealand and New Zealand Pork Industry Board, has sought further restriction on residential visitor accommodation, which is currently a permitted activity subject to relevant standards. As a minimum, Mr. Hodgson has sought changes to the permitted rule to require compliance with the building setback standard and to require maximum occupancy of 6 guests per night. I agree with Mr. Hodgson that the rule should include reference to setbacks. While I note the setbacks are already required for a new residential dwelling by Rule GRUS R1, I acknowledge that residential visitor accommodation could be proposed in a residential unit that is long established. I also note that it is consistent with the approach that's been taken in the residential zones. With regard to specifying a maximum number of occupants, I do not consider that this is necessary. I consider that the scale is already sufficiently managed by requiring the activity to occur within an existing residential unit and the associated definition for residential visitor accommodation. So GRUS R12, quarrying activities. Mr. Ensor for Fulton has sought changes to the rules for quarrying activities to remove matter of discretion for consideration of amenity effects of the movement of vehicles, to replace reference to remediate with rehabilitate, and to broaden the discretionary activity to apply to activities to include recovery and recycling of construction and demolition material. As previously discussed, I remain of the opinion that amenity effects associated with the movement of vehicles should be captured. I agree that the proposed change of remediate to rehabilitate is appropriate and consider that that accurately reflects the direction. With regard to broadening the discretionary activity, I may need to consider this further once hearing from Mr. Ensor, but based on my understanding of the activity described, this would appear to be a clean filling activity which would be captured by the discretionary rule I've previously discussed and recommended.
Yes. Maybe that there might be some merit in you meeting with Mr. Ensor, depending on what we hear from him. just to see whether further plan certainty can be given, but let's see what Mr. Ensor comes up with this afternoon.
Yes, I guess to clarify with both this rule and the previous rule he'd suggested, I don't disagree that shouldn't be provided for. It's more just that I don't think there's a particular issue currently.
That's right, and you've had the chance to discuss interpretation issues with council officers.
That's right.
Mr. Ensor was only hearing that for the first time, and it's whether he feels comfortable relying on that interpretation issue, or whether the more certainty can be given in the realms of the plan itself. So let's just park that for the moment. But you would be opposed to exploring those opportunities.
I'd be open to that, yes.
Okay, Rule 15, visitor accommodation.
Okay. Mr. Aburn for Wairarapa Wine Growers Association, Marnborough Holdings Limited and Aburn Popova Trust has sought that the activity status for visitor accommodation be elevated to a non-compliant status where it occurs within the Marnborough Schools overlay. Mr. Aburn considers that this would align with the policy direction, which requires avoidance of incompatible activities within the Marnborough Schools overlay. I acknowledge that the objectives and policies are directive. While I acknowledge that the objectives and policies are directive, I do not consider that there is a disconnect between the rule framework for visitor accommodation. I consider that the discretionary activity status will allow the council to consider all relevant adverse effects and decline the consent where it is contrary to the outcome sought for the general rural zone or the Marnborough Schools overlay. I also do not consider that there's evidence that visitor accommodation poses a greater threat to other potentially contrary activities within the Marnborough Schools overlay, for instance, residential or residential lifestyle.
Yes, can you just pause there? I'm sure there'll be some questions. I'll just check my panel.
No.
Okay, what do I do?
Right.
We're waiting.
You've read Mr. Aburn's evidence.
Yes, I have, yes.
Aburn refers to a strong policy direction, particularly in GRUZ P7 for avoidance. Sorry, yes. My reading of both the policy 7 and policy 8 is that they don't necessarily use the term avoidance. The avoidance term comes in at P4, which is avoiding inappropriate subdivision. Am I missing something there?
No, you're not. I guess the avoidance is largely, yes, P4 is the avoidance direction. The P7 and P8 are the directive requirements. So P8 in particular would be that directive policy for what is anticipated there. Activities that aren't otherwise are sought to be avoided. So that would be the clause BI, avoiding the fragmentation of land that compromises the use for primary production activities. So I guess that's where the main directive nature would come for those activities that Mr. Aburn is concerned with.
What's the policy guidance for visitor accommodation then in the Marnborough Soils overlay?
There's no specific direction for visitor accommodation. It would come into other land uses that could compromise use. If the panel was of an opinion to include a non-compliant status, I would suggest that there should be a link in there as well to have that specific land use, as it would be essentially the only activity that's been elevated to non-compliant.
Is policy P4 relevant to this issue?
Only as it relates to subdivision.
Policy P6.
P6 for reverse sensitivity. Yes, that would also apply. I guess that's general direction. That doesn't specifically apply to the Marnborough Stores overlay, but yes, reverse sensitivity direction would apply. That would direct to avoid the establishment of sensitive activities, visitor accommodation being one of those.
And there is a definition of new sensitive activities, isn't there?
Sensitive activities, yes.
Alex. Can you just remind me what that
definition is? Yes, I can. I might just actually need to clarify it hasn't been amended from here in stream 1.
Right. Recall it being amended, but let's assume for the time being that it hasn't.
If it hasn't, it means any use of land and or buildings for, and it lists specific activities. So residential activities, educational facilities, community facilities, healthcare activities, supported residential care facilities, papakainga, visitor accommodation, and residential visitor accommodation.
Okay, so there's specific reference to that term.
That's right.
So it doesn't rely on the term residential activity. It's got its own reference. So P6 is directly relevant.
That's right, yes.
P7 and P8, the bit of words are identify and protect and manage subdivision use and development. How would those two policies relate to, firstly, discretionary activity and secondly, non-complying activity?
I guess so protect is the main directive there for that area. Protect would infer that you need to have an ability to find or a good framework for declining consents, which would not be compatible with that, or that could result in a loss of that value. The difference between non-compliant and discretionary may be a question of how much certainty you want with that. In my opinion, I believe discretionary provides sufficient ability for the councils to consider all matters. And if it's incompatible, it's clearly incompatible with the zone, with the overlay, that there would be an ability to decline. Non-compliant is I guess it would introduce the gateway test of having to justify that it either is of no more than minor adverse effect, or that it meets all of the policies of a plan. So it would give that certainty, but I guess for plan makers, you do need to have a reasonable amount of evidence that it does need to be elevated to that status, that in all of those circumstances, they are very likely to be incompatible.
Yes. Is the risk posed by visitor accommodation any greater than any other potential activities to the risk to the soil overlay and the activities within the soils overlay?
Based on the evidence I've received, I don't think it is. I don't have evidence to suggest it is. Say, for instance, residential activities, they've been identified to be a particular issue. At the moment, they're discretionary. So they've been treated the same. So for visitor accommodation to be elevated, there'd have to be, in my opinion, evidence that that is a greater risk than residential activities.
Yes. Is it, just going back to policy P6, is there any distinguishing factors between residential and visitor accommodation as new sensitive activities in terms of the avoidance directive and that first part of the policy?
No, at this stage, it uses the defined term, and the defined term does not have any embedded hierarchy to it. So all sensitive activities are treated
The same.
one and the same.
Okay. Thank you for that. Just check any further questions? No. Okay. Thank you. We'll hear from Mr. Aburn on that. That takes us to just off my place here.
The graph R16
Rural
on
industry.
paragraph 6.
Yes, rural industry. Thank you.
Yes. Mr. Ensor for Fulton Hogan and Mr. Matheson for Rural Contractors New Zealand Incorporated oppose that all rural industries are discretionary activity. Both parties have sought that a permitted activity rule is included for smaller scale rural industries or a rural contractor depot rule. In their statements, further evidence is provided for why the activity should be enabled. Both parties have also argued that relying on no implementation issues from the operative plan does not justify the rule being rolled over. So that reference there is in the operative plan, there was a discretionary activity status. No implementation issues were identified during the draft plan process, so we effectively rolled it over on that basis. As noted in my section 42A, while I generally agree that rural industries could be better provided for, the current rule reflects what was included in the operative plan. Based on the feedback received by council officers, there has not been any implementation issues with this, including the rule applying to small scale operators. I accept that this alone should not be a reason to include such a rule. I also agree that the objective and policy direction of the general rural zone anticipates rural industries and seeks to provide for them. To better align with the objectives and policies, I recommend that the rural industry rule is changed to be restricted discretionary, subject to relevant matters of discretion. This will provide greater certainty to rural industries that can be provided for. With regard to small scale rural industries, I remain of the opinion that there is not sufficient evidence to demonstrate the benefits outweigh the costs for a permitted activity rule. I also consider that the changes I've recommended will provide greater certainty that smaller scale rural industries can be provided for.
Can you just take us to the rule change then? Where do we see?
So that is on. That is on page 35, at the bottom of page 35, and that is existing rule R16. The matters of discretion are very similar to that of other similar rules, so quarrying activities, for instance. So managing the character and amenity values, noise, vibration, vehicle access, transport network, and then visual amenity and character.
Yes. Same wording as the one on quarry.
Yes.
Okay, so the recommended change is to reduce the activity status from discretionary to restricted discretionary for rural industry.
And at this stage, yes.
Yes, the recommendation. And does that include rural contractor depots?
Yes, it would. Yes.
And is there a scale component here, or is it rural industry per se?
If they meet the definition of a rural industry and they're not otherwise provided for by a different rule, then yes, they would be captured by that. And I guess to clarify on the reasons for not including anything more enabling, it's that I haven't seen sufficient evidence to suggest that, one, there is a major need for that at a smaller scale, and two, that the effects could be appropriately managed in all circumstances.
And so I see the last matter of discretion would be an assessment of the loss of highly productive land. So the RDA status that you're recommending isn't dependent on whether it's on or not on.
That's right.
HDL, it's okay. Anything in the rural zone.
That's right, yes.
Okay. Is that contemplated by the MPS?
Industries, would have to have a look, but I would anticipate it depends on the industry itself. It does include supporting activities for primary production, which I anticipate a number of the rural industries would meet. But it would come down to the specific ones. I can have a look now, though.
Well, you can come back to us on that if you like. I just don't want us to be setting up a potential policy mismatch with the MPS.
That's right.
Okay, and maybe that's that was something we could take up with Mr. Ensor again. Okay, that takes us now onto the actual standards for the rural zone.
Yes. So relocatable buildings. Mr. Hooper for Heavy Haulage Associate has sought the deletion of performance standards for relocatable buildings, specifically the performance bond requirement for that. Ms. Wheatley has responded to a similar point raised in her right of reply for hearing stream 2. Ms. Wheatley has recommended retention of the performance bond requirements. I agree with the reasons stated by Ms. Wheatley, and I recommend that the performance bond requirement is retained in the rural zones.
Big questions there from me, Mr. Horrell. First is, I understood that, well, let me just provide some context. Mr. Barnard Thompson for the submitter gave a brief appearance in hearing stream 2, I think. One, it may be one. His association were in the middle of having their annual conference at the time, and he wasn't able to give it the time that it needed. So he agreed to come along to this hearing, and he's going to bring his planner off along. But as I understood it, the concern that the submitter had wasn't just with the performance bond, but it was with the requirement for traffic management plans also. Does that ring a bell with you?
In terms of these, I didn't see the tabled evidence that was presented, but I believe the main issue that Mr. Hooper had raised was the performance bond, but I may need to go back to that to check that.
Okay.
Hearing stream 2, sorry.
So the matter of discretion and requirement around the transport routes.
Yes.
That was intended by the.
Yeah, I think I've called it traffic management plans, but yes, it was a traffic issue, wasn't it?
I'm still contending that.
Yes. So the performance bonds are a standard on permitted activity. Where you don't meet that permitted activity, you become a RDA, and the matter of discretion relate transport. Okay, but there was no requirement as a permitted activity to submit traffic management plans. Yes. Okay. Mr. Hooper's on tomorrow, so we've got some time up our sleeve there. Okay.
I guess to note with this, given this is a common rule that's applied across all of the zones,
Yes.
it may be that we'll need to consider that as well in the context of how that may be consistently applied as well.
on a zone by zone basis.
That's right.
Yeah, whether there's a need for some idiosyncrasies.
Yes.
Okay. Well, Ms. Wheatley was reporting in relation to,
Residential zones.
it was hearing stream 1, wasn't
No,
it?
two.
Two?
No.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
probably
yeah,
urban zones and
two.
open space zones. Yes.
Yes.
Which- Okay, thank you. Right, now on to part 2, the appropriateness of rural lifestyle with zoning.
Yes. Ms. McWilliam for Addison Shore has further questioned the appropriateness of rural lifestyle zone. Specifically, Ms. McWilliam has raised that the potential yield of the rural lifestyle zone has failed to account for private covenants on allotments on Ardsley Lane. Further investigation of the feasibility for on-site servicing is required throughout the rural lifestyle zone. And providing for rural lifestyle in the general rural zone would be a more effective and efficient method than retaining the rural lifestyle zone. I was not previously aware of the private covenant over properties on Ardsley Lane, and I agree that it would impact the yield in the immediate term. However, given this form of covenant can be lifted, particularly where the underlying regulatory framework has changed, I do not consider that this should be a deciding factor in the appropriateness of zoning land rural lifestyle. With relation to further investigation of on-site servicing, I consider that the advice from Mr. Birch provides sufficient certainty that there will not be significant constraints to on-site servicing across the rural lifestyle zone. I also note that it is not practicable nor reasonable for the councils to undertake the level of investigation that Ms. McWilliam has implied as part of a full district plan review process. As I've acknowledged in my section 42A report, the recommended reduction to the spatial extent of the rural lifestyle zone means that the supply enabled does not meet the long-term demand in Marsden. I put forward 3 options of how this reduction may be responded to. Ms. McWilliam has implied preference for option 2, as I've described in my section 42A report. This an alternative approach of providing for rural lifestyle in the general rural zone through an approach similar to what has been provided in Carterton and South Wairarapa. I remain of the opinion that retaining the rural lifestyle zone is the most efficient and effective method for providing lifestyle in Marsden. I do acknowledge that there may not be certainty in the short term, particularly if additional land needs to be identified via a separate plan change process. However, I consider that this will provide a greater long-term outcome of ensuring lifestyle development is undertaken in a consistent and coordinated manner. I note that the current recommended extent will continue to provide for opportunities in the short term.
Okay, I know there's going to be some questions. Ms. Craig, you want to lead off on this?
Yeah, we've seen the recommended reduction in the rural lifestyle zone. Now, looking through the information given around the ability to generate income, it seems to be very much based on a theory basis rather than a realism. Actually going in and looking, we talk of highest and best use. It's used all the time. The ability to amalgamate these properties. Now, when you actually go and physically look at these properties, I would consider that almost all these properties, except for the 2 largest, would very easily fit within this rural lifestyle zone. What's the ability? I have discussed out of the room that with the court case having gone through, that the ability to come back and revisit this could be quite limited. Correct?
So do you want me to respond to the first part or the second part? So the first part, so in terms of the parameters that we use, so I may need to have Ms. Chambers respond to that. That was her report. But for context, she has followed the National Policy Statement, Clause 3.10, which specifies a very specific requirements on what you must achieve. And one of those is long-term, and I think it references 30 years. So that's a very high bar. That's looking at 30 years, you have to anticipate, well, what could occur in 30 years? What's reasonable to assume could occur in 30 years? I might let Ms. Chambers respond further to that.
Can I just come on? That's good to assume what's happening in the next 30 years. But in the previous 30 years, they've been totally unproductive. So what's going to change? We can see a huge investment in infrastructure and irrigation is needed to possibly have this happen. And you don't get a return for 2 to 5 years. Fairly major constraints on anyone wanting to do this.
I might, if you're happy to continue the response.
I just want to make sure that we're talking about the approach to the rural lifestyle zone here.
This-
not the zoning of.
We'll go for approaches.
So
I guess it possibly is associated though, given it was a key issue 1 matter that I recommended the reduction. It may just be because I haven't had, I actually know that, there hasn't been any further evidence specifically relating to that. So we may not talk to that. So it is appropriate to talk to this now if you're happy for us to do so.
yes, I am. I just don't want to get sort of attracted to specific properties at this stage.
No, so this is, generally the rural lifestyle zone. So, Juliet, would you mind talking further to the methodology you adopted?
Yeah. I mean, we've followed what's directed by clause 3.10 in the NPS HPL, which specifically requires you to look at, what the potential of that property, not its current use. So, and that potential land uses needs to include also looking at amalgamation, lease opportunities, improved land management strategies. It does take that real long-term lens, and it's quite prescriptive around what needs to be looked at there.
Still, just a comment, I still remain unconvinced as to the methods around this.
I guess that our response is that we've taken a direct or a literal view of the NPS and have taken that 30 years as you have to assess it as that. It doesn't have, say, a provision for practical or immediately practical complications to that. So it may be more of an issue with the direction of the NPS as opposed to the methodology we've adopted, which is directly in line with that, I guess. Your second question was, is there going to be complications for identifying additional lands? The short answer to that is yes, there could be. It would require upfront evaluation of land. I guess the difference between the rural lifestyle zone we identified and future land is that we have the benefit of foresight. We can actually factor that in when identifying the lands. The timing of when the rural lifestyle zone was identified was immediately prior to the NPS coming into effect. So it hadn't been a key consideration at that time, whereas going forward for additional lands, that would probably be the key consideration. Does it meet the exemption? Can we get it past that exemption? And then does it meet the other characteristics?
What would be useful, Mr. Horrell, and we've got time, is if you could just explain to the panel the rationale for the lifestyle approach in Marsden District versus the rationale and approach to lifestyle provision for Carterton and South Wairarapa, and how that came about.
Yes, I guess we at the start of the review process, this was identified as a key resource management issue. We began by identifying spatial extents of where we may be able to identify a rural lifestyle zone. So the rural lifestyle zone was the preferred approach from the start. I guess that also aligns with
across all 3 districts.
That's right. And that does align with the national planning standards that does say if you're going to provide for lifestyle, try and do it in a lifestyle zone. So we look to identify land. The Marston Rural Lifestyle Zone was identified. In South Wairarapa and Carterton, there was significant constraints to identifying particularly cohesive areas that could be identified for lifestyle. So generally there would be fragmented parcels, but they would sit in amongst larger land holdings that are of productive use. So to identify a wider area would compromise our strategic direction or the issue would identify it. So the decision was made that, well, I guess we looked into further options for South Wairarapa and Carterton. And with the major issue being fragmentation of land, the approach was taken that smaller allotments generally have less productive capacity. 4 hectares was selected in those districts, being generally a distribution that's near the towns, so it's in a good proximity for lifestyle, and it limits to what the reasonable demand would be. There is a difference of approach, and ideally we would be having one approach, but this is a product of the issues that we came across when identifying the options.
So by implication, am I hearing that the same cohesion and fragmentation issues didn't exist in the Masterton district, or not to the same extent?
That's right, yes, or at least in the area surrounding Masterton.
Okay. Which presumably allowed the identification, a spatial extent or identification of a zone, as opposed to allowing for rules within the GRUZ.
That's right, yes.
Okay. And now there's been a reduction, or an effective reduction in the yield for the Masterton one.
Yes, by around a third of the yield has been reduced.
Okay.
That yield, I should note, is based over a 10-year period. So we're anticipating this plan will have a life of 10 years. So we're looking to provide for opportunities in line with the strategic direction for the next 10 years. So that reduction of a third is likely to result in implications more in the medium to long term than in the short term. There is going to be those opportunities in the short term, given there is 2/3 of that still enabled.
Yes. And when you identified the 3 options as part of particularly as part of the 42A exercise, option 2 is essentially the approach adopted for Carterton and South Wairarapa, the 4 hectare approach.
Yes.
Is there any planning reason, given the reduced yield in the zone at Marston, why the Marston and Carterton approach couldn't coexist with the zoning approach?
The main issue would be whether you're causing, I guess, with rural lifestyle generally, there is going to be some fragmentation. Whether that's fragmentation that is acceptable or not is a question. So in Marston, they've confined that to directly around the town. In South Wairarapa and Carterton, it's on those smaller lots. To do both in Marston would increase that fragmentation, to have both around the town and throughout the district. I guess one other point I did allude to in my section 42A is the distribution of the less than 4 hectare lots does extend further than just around the town for Marston. So there could be potential for perverse outcomes of having isolated pockets of lifestyle in a fairly far distance from service centres.
Yes. Is that characteristic, the distribution of 4 hectare lots away from the townships, does that characteristic not exist in South Wairarapa and Carterton?
to a lesser extent. It doesn't remove that completely, but not as confined around the towns.
So can you just confirm what's the minimum size in the lifestyle zone?
So the minimum allotment size for subdividing is 0.5 hectares.
Thank you.
But to qualify,
In the lifestyle zone, it's you don't have to have a property threshold. It can be however, so long as your property has more than 1 hectare, I guess, given you'd have to maintain 1 hectare.
So the residual, if you subdivide, it's the residual of 1 hectare left.
That's right. Or sorry, 0.5 hectare. So
So you can go to
Yeah.
0.5. Sorry,
So I guess in that example, the minimum property to enable subdivision would have to be 1.01 hectares. So you'd have to have 0.5 as a balance and 0.5 for the new allotment.
yep. Okay.
sorry, I meant in relation to the lifestyle provision within the rural zone, starting point 4 hectares.
It is, so it's less than 4 hectares. So in that regard, the property has to be effectively 3.99 hectares and below. And then there's also balance requirements for how much land needs to be maintained. For one additional allotment, it'd be 1.5 hectares. For 2 additional, it would be 2.5 hectares. That maintains a relative density there of ensuring it doesn't create overly intensive development within the general rural zone.
We may need some more evidence in relation to this matter of what you wrote in relation to coexisting of the zone and the enabling rule for less than 4 hectare allotments in terms of the spatial distribution of those lots, just to try and illustrate your point about that it's less obvious than in Carson and South Wairarapa.
Yes.
That's a sort of an evidential basis I think we would need to look at.
I guess something to note in addition to that is that Masterton District Council have indicated preference for a lifestyle zone over the alternative. In my opinion, if you were to make up the difference, I would be recommending either the general rural zone or a lifestyle zone. To have two is to, I guess, if you're going to provide for it in one, you should just rely on one method.
Yeah, that's information we will need to make our
Yes.
decision. Any other?
Yeah, when there doesn't seem to be any requirement for council services for wastewater and stormwater. In fact, it's the opposite. They're self-contained. And I know we talked about this right in the workshops about if you have a proliferation of half hectare sections, you're going to have a hell of a lot of wastewater treatment systems congregated in a very small area. What are we talking? 200 hectares. That's maths. It's 400 or 500.
Yeah.
Septic systems in a very small area.
Yes.
Is that a ecological disaster waiting to happen?
So Greater Wellington Regional Council tabled further evidence on this issue. So this is a matter that they'd raised concern over, is the potential cumulative groundwater effects. My position is that is a matter that is managed through the Natural Resources Plan. In the Natural Resources Plan in that area, it requires consent for every discharge as a controlled activity. So there would be an ability for the council to consider them on a case-by-case basis. Given it's controlled, they have to be granted, but they would have to be to a certain standard. So the wastewater systems would have to be likely to be tertiary treated, so of a very high quality that would meet the groundwater requirements and also factor in those cumulative effects. If there was an identified issue of cumulative effects in that area, that would be a matter for the regional council to consider and take further action.
But it's too late.
If they observed an effect, they may have to start considering that. But in their evidence, they've noted that they consider that the current approach is robust and would allow them to consider those effects. I think in their tabled evidence, they did state that the rule framework anticipates that.
So what would be the effect if the committee said no to rural lifestyle zone?
What would be
What would be the effect if we just said, actually, we're not going to go down the rural lifestyle zone?
if you
What's the
if you didn't go down the rural lifestyle zone, I guess the question would be, how are you meeting the strategic direction objective of providing for opportunities for lifestyle in the rural environment? That would be where you'd have to consider the alternatives, and that might be the less than 4 hectare rule. So that would be as opposed to the rural lifestyle zone.
So why would it be any different from the rules that apply to Carterton and South Wairarapa? Why couldn't you use the same rule?
You could use the same rules.
And so
The difference would be,
would we not be meeting some requirement if we did that?
it would be, I guess, in terms of a long-term outcome, it's less desirable. It's not identified in one place, and you can't strategically identify where the lifestyle is going to go. It's going to go where the demand is for the less than 4 hectares. So it would meet the demand or the opportunities, but it's just not undertaken in a consistent and cohesive manner. It's not going to occur in one particular location. That's the main difference.
And Mr. Horrell was going to provide us with some spatial indication of where those 4 hectare allotments are further out from Masterton.
Yes.
If we went to the other rules, it would be 40 hectare minimums, wouldn't it? Because they're in the general rural zone.
Yes. If you did remove the rural lifestyle zone and not provide any alternative, there would effectively be no specific provision for rural lifestyle. Every lifestyle application would have to be considered on its merits as a non-compliant activity or a discretionary activity.
As it is for South Wairarapa and Carterton.
Where they're more than 4 hectares, yes.
The options are pretty clear.
Yeah.
We either retain the rural lifestyle zone in Masterton, or we replicate the approach for Carterton and South Wairarapa in the absence of retaining that.
I'm trying to see what would be the effect.
I can, when I provide my reply, I'll also talk to the numbers of what would be enabled and where that would be enabled. My recommendation in my section 42 was to retain the current extent and to identify additional land. So can't provide an indication of that, given that hasn't been undertaken yet, but I can provide the 2 scenarios of as it exists now with the 4 hectares coexisting, or the alternative of just having the less than 4 hectares.
So to give some context of why I'm asking, because you've recommended reducing the size from 400 hectares down to 200, rounding off. So the intensification in that area is smaller, therefore more intense.
I guess the intensification hasn't actually changed. It still remains 0.5 hectares.
Yeah, but relatively it's
less. Yeah.
In that 30-year period, it's going to be more concentrated in that 30-year. If you do this over 400 hectares as opposed to 200 hectares, logically the development in that area is going to be, the pace of development is largely going to be increased over that 30-year period because it's less land.
Yes, I guess it does depend on desire as well of landowners. That is something to note with the lifestyle zone. If a large landowner did not want to subdivide their land, that's completely within their rights, and that would also impact the potential yield. So the yield does assume that everything's going to be subdivided.
Mr. Horrell, is there submission scope to replicate the South Wairarapa and Carterton approach in Masterton?
Yes, there is.
Does it come from Edison Shore?
I think there was about 3 submitters who specifically requested the rule apply in Masterton as well as South Wairarapa and Carterton.
Thank you. Okay, well, at the moment, we'll be hearing from Adams, I'm sure, later in the proceedings. I'm just not too sure how we handle the next issue, Mr. Horrell. This is the Gary Daniel property at Te Road. I note your paragraph 79 that matter might be better considered in hearing stream 13 once we've heard on the natural hazards hearing, which is, I think, hearing stream 9. Yes, hearing stream 9. But I note that you've got your witness here, and the submitter has also their witnesses.
Yes, so I guess to clarify that point, in summary of the rezoning request, Mr. Daniel's property, which is directly south, there's two main reasons of a difference of opinion with the rezone request. One is that it doesn't meet the national policy statement for highly productive land, which Ms. Chambers has talked to in her hearing statement. The other is the flood hazard, or not so much the flood hazard, but more the fault hazard extent significantly limits what subdivision would be enabled.
Yes.
I guess the benefit of responding to that second matter in hearing stream 13 is that would be following the natural hazards hearing, and we may have a more of an understanding of that spatial extent.
I understand that. I guess what I'm trying to get at is we still need to deal with the first matter dealing with the MPS, though, don't we?
That's right, yes.
Okay, well, do you want to hear from Ms. Chambers first, or do you want to provide some context?
I can read to this, and then I might ask if Ms. Chambers is happy to read her statement as well.
Thank you.
So Ms. Blackwell for Gary Daniel has provided further evidence to support the rezone request for lands located at 125 Te Ori Road. Ms. Blackwell has relied on supporting the evidence by a primary production expert. In her statement, Ms. Blackwell has responded to the specific matters I'd raised for rejecting the rezone request. And this response includes evidence from Mr. Buse that provides an assessment against clause 3.10 of the MPS highly productive land and indicates that the property would meet the exemption. Consideration of the feasibility for on-site servicing, which indicates that there is an ability to provide for servicing at the site. Further evidence to support the removal or reduction of the extent of fault hazard throughout the site, and consideration of the impact that flood hazard would have to potential lifestyle development. Ms. Blackwell indicates that the natural hazards direction would effectively manage potential flood hazard risk while allowing for reasonable lifestyle development. I refer to the hearing statement for Ms. Juliet Chambers, who provides specific response to Mr. Bue's evidence. In her statement, Ms. Chambers disagrees with the overall conclusion made by Mr. Buse, given the lack of supporting economic analysis. With relation to on-site servicing, I generally agree with Ms. Blackwell that the land is of similar characteristics to other parts of the rural lifestyle zone, which Mr. Birch had assessed as being feasible. However, given the nature of natural hazards within the site and the presence of water bodies, I would like to receive further advice from Marsden District Council engineers before confirming my position. Due to the limited availability, I've been unable to receive the comments ahead of this hearing. I will confirm my position with any additional comments from the council engineers through my right of reply statement at the end of this hearing.
Yes, and we'll get Mr. Wesley to just record that. Thank you.
With regard to natural hazards, I cannot comment on Ms. Blackwell's evidence regarding the appropriateness of fault hazards identified throughout the site. This will be considered during hearing stream 9. I do, however, acknowledge that if the fault hazard was to be removed or significantly reduced, this may change my view of the overall constraints to development. For example, if the fault hazard was removed, from the site. This would increase the enabled capacity from 16 to 51. And I've shown that in figure 2, directly below that. If the only hazard was the flood hazard constraint, I would generally agree with Ms. Blackwell that this can be appropriately managed on a case-by-case basis, relying on natural hazard provisions. This is on the basis that only a small part of the overall property is impacted. Therefore, if subdivision was not practicable, it would not significantly impact reasonable lifestyle development on the site, on the property, sorry. I note that one of the submitters who sought rezoning made a request to the panel to present their evidence during hearing stream 13. I suggest that further response to Gary Daniel's submission can be provided at this time. I note that this would be following the natural hazards hearing. I might, if you're happy for me to do so, I might Ms. Chambers to read through her statement.
Do you want me to read the whole statement?
No, that won't be
Finish.
necessary. We've done that. Just take us to the highlights and your key conclusions, Ms. Chambers.
So just read through the matters 1 to 4? Or just my overall conclusion?
Your overall conclusions.
Okay, so essentially, based on the evidence provided, there wasn't enough evidence to assess whether the property could meet clause 3.10 of the NPS HPL. There was no economic analysis provided as part of the report, which is a key element there. So that was essentially my conclusion, that if it's to be considered further, then there would need to be more evidence provided.
Thank you. In your paragraph A, you referred to the exemption not only under 310 but 3.7. Can you just elaborate on that, please?
That 3.7 is more just a deferral kind of clause, saying that it's avoiding rezoning of highly productive land for rural lifestyle. So territorial authorities must avoid rezoning of highly productive land as rural lifestyle, except as provided for in clause 3.10. So that's just more of a formality.
Okay. So the key tests are contained in clause 3.10.
Yes.
And you've helpfully included that clause in your appendix 1. Can you just take us through the matters in which you feel this proposal falls short on in terms of those criteria?
So it's mainly, and there's no economic analysis here. I mean, it's not really clear what the permanent or long-term constraints are. I know lack of water or irrigation and soils were mentioned, but they, could be a bit clearer there. They've also got to really step through every form, as to why, why different land uses are not economically viable, including, going through all the alternative production strategies, etc., different land management strategies.
Okay, so you would have expected a more robust analysis backed up by some economic analysis.
Yes.
Okay. You don't have any disagreement on the spatial extent of the L3 land, though?
No.
You agreed on that with Mr. Bewes?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Have you visited the site at all?
No, not that specific site.
Okay. The requirements in 3.10 under 3.1 are conjunctive, aren't they? All of those requirements must be met in order for the council to allow highly productive land to be subdivided, used or developed was owned, not
Yes.
just one of them. So that
Yep.
they must all be met, A, B and C.
Yes.
There's no discretion inherent in 3.10.
No, it's a, really high bar.
Right. And clause 2 outlines what the applicant needs to demonstrate and to meet those tests.
Yep.
And that's informed by clause 3.
Yes.
Have you been involved in other situations where papers have been made or rezoning of land that or under clause 3.10?
Yes. Yep.
For
For single sites.
yes,
Yes.
as a rezoning or as a resource consent?
As
Or
a
both?
resource consent.
Okay. Let's just see if the panel have any further questions, Ms. Chambers. No. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Chambers. Mr. Orrell, I have some sympathy for your suggestion about deferring some of these matters to later hearings, particularly if we have more certainty about the extent of the flood hazard, the fault hazard lines. And the time to do that would be at hearing stream 13. But it seems to me that the first obstacle that the submitter has to get over is the clause 3.10 of the
That's right.
SHPL.
Yes, that's right.
Would it be, in light of Ms. Chambers' critique of the information, would it be appropriate to give the submitter an opportunity to deal with what Ms. Chambers deals with as the shortcomings of the report in hearing stream 13?
Yes, they could. I guess we're also happy to respond in this hearing stream if the expert is prepared and ready to respond.
Okay.
But as I noted, there is another submitter who's also sought a rezoning request and will be responding to similar matters. So for efficiency, we can respond to both at the same time.
Yes, which submitter is that?
So that is
Eastleigh?
yes.
Yes.
Sorry, not Eastleigh.
Barley Hill.
Oh, not in rural lifestyle, sorry.
We just. So it was James Wallace, Leslie Wallace, and Rosemary.
Yes.
Ardsley.
Yep. Okay, well, let's reflect on that, and we can discuss that over the lunch in German and decide how we want to handle that.
Mm.
Okay, and we'll be also mindful of the presentation that Daniel's going to give us. Okay, that takes us on to paragraph 80.
Yes.
Now, I think we can take that as read. And I was very familiar with this issue.
Okay.
Stream 2.
And you may be able to take the next point also as read.
Yes, indeed. That takes us on to minimum allotment sizes.
Yes, so part 3, key issue 1, which was the overall approach and minimum allotment size. Mr. Maddich for Federated Farmers and Mr. Hooper for Colin and Helen Southey have sought that the minimum allotment size in the general rural zone is reduced. Mr. Aburn for Wairarapa Winegrowers Association, Martinborough Holdings Limited and Aburn Papova Trust has sought that the minimum lot size within the Marnborough Soils overlay is reduced to provide for subdivision for viticulture. Mr Maddich has sought that the minimum allotment size is reduced to 20 hectares. Mr Maddich provides the following reasons for why this is more appropriate. One, it generally reflects the minimum that has been adopted in several other district plans based on his own analysis. Allotments between 20 and 40 hectares can be used for productive purposes. There is a low demand for hobby farms or large lifestyle blocks between 20 to 40 hectares. And there has been a reasonable demand for allotments between 20 to 40 hectares based on property data over the last 13 years. Mr Hooper has sought that the minimum lot size is reduced to 10 hectares. Mr Hooper provides the following reasons for why this is appropriate. The current 40 hectare minimum will rule out the establishment of artesian type producers. A minimum 10 hectares provides for primary production subdivision, and there is unlikely to be demand for large lifestyle subdivision at this size. The current minimum is overly focused on economically viable production lots, which is overly conservative. Mr Aburn has provided further evidence to support the reduction of the minimum lot size in the Marnborough Soils overlay for viticulture. In his evidence, Mr Aburn has implied that the rule framework unfairly penalises vineyard operators by elevating the activity status from controlled in the operative plan to discretionary. Mr Aburn notes that the framework and the 40 hectare minimum generally could disincentivise further vineyard development. As outlined in my Section 42A report, the 40 hectare minimum does not provide for all primary production subdivision. Namely, the minimum would not provide for subdivision for viticulture or pip fruit based on land required for an economically viable unit. As Mr Hooper has identified, this is primarily focused on primary production that would be economically viable. I acknowledge that there are additional forms of subdivision that could provide for some productive use, but not be the primary income source for the property owner. In my view, it is appropriate to rely on economic viability when setting parameters for subdivision that is going to be enabled. I consider that this aligns with retaining productive capacity. In those circumstances described by Mr Hooper, while some productive use can be retained, there would be loss of productive capacity compared with retaining a larger allotment. As I've discussed in my Section 42A report, the minimum allotment size must strike a balance between enabling appropriate primary production and avoiding inappropriate subdivision. As both Mr Maddich and Mr Hooper have inferred, the second part of this is subjective. In the context of rural lifestyle subdivision, the demanded allotment size comes down to the individual's own preference and desire. For instance, a larger block may be sought for a retiring farmer who would want to retain some land for small-scale primary production, or others may just want to live in a rural setting on a low-maintenance allotment. That said, there is general agreement between Mr Maddich, Mr Hooper and myself that the highest demand for lifestyle is of allotments less than 4 hectares, and the demand for lifestyle progressively decreases as the allotment size increases. When considering alternative minimums that have been suggested, I would be more closely aligned with Mr Maddich and agree that there is unlikely to be much demand for lifestyle allotments greater than 20 hectares. However, I remain of the opinion that there's a lack of evidence to suggest that additional primary production subdivision that is economically viable is demanded between 20 to 40 hectares. I should note that I'm not suggesting that the demand does not exist or that it is not appropriate, but rather on the balance, it does not justify the risk of enabling all subdivision down to 20 hectares due to the cost associated with land fragmentation. With regard to Mr Aburn, again, I acknowledge that the minimum lot size does not provide for viticulture. While I agree that viticulture subdivision should be enabled, I consider that a 4 hectare minimum would pose a significant risk to further inappropriate subdivision. This risk would be associated with the controlled activity status that does not allow an ability for the council to decline consent and the limitations on subdivision consent for managing the future land use of the site. And I refer there to a rule cannot require, or I guess a subdivision consent cannot require somebody to maintain in a particular land use. A consent applicant could propose, say, a consent order or something on the consent, but that has to be by the applicant, not by the council. Overall, I remain of the opinion that a 40 hectare minimum remains appropriate. I acknowledge that this is conservative. However, in the context of the significant resource management issue it responds to, I consider that it is proportionate. In addition to this, I consider that the discretionary activity pathway provides for other appropriate subdivision is not otherwise captured. The status allows for case-by-case consideration by the councils without incurring the gateway test non-compliant activity rule would.
Right, just going to ask you a couple of questions before I hand it over to the panel. The default activity status for both not meeting the 40 hectare minimum or in both the rural zone and in the Martinborough overlay, is it in both cases discretionary?
It would be discretionary if it complies with or if it meets the exemption in the MPS for highly productive land.
Yeah.
But yes, anything less than 40 is discretionary.
If it doesn't meet that, does it become non-compliant?
Fine, that's right.
Yes. So a 20 hectare subdivision allotment in the rural zone would be discretionary activity. And a 4 hectare allotment in the Martinborough soils overlay would be a discretionary activity.
That's right, yes.
Okay, any questions, panel, of Mr. Horrell on this matter?
Yes.
Yes. Thanks, Alistair.
Okay. Federated Farmers in their evidence gave the table of other councils that have gone for the 20 hectares or lower. Do you know when those rules were passed, or have you done any inquiry as to say how relevant are they, given the MPS highly productive land came out in September and then updated in August this year? Are they relevant to?
I would have to go back and look through them, but there are very limited district plans that have gone through the process since the MPS came into effect.
Yeah, so that would be useful to know where are we like the first cab off the rank, as it were.
Might also want to put that question too.
Yeah.
Well, but
I've got that down as a question for them as well.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Second one, you talked about what was the words used? Significant risk if it was 4 hectares minimum in the overlay area. You've spoken about how the 40 hectares doesn't provide for viticulture zone in the way that land is used. What would you consider would be a level that would still achieve what we're trying to do, but remove that significant risk? Like, are we talking 6, 8, 10, 12?
At this stage, it is 40. At this stage, based on the evidence of what activities need to be enabled and where the line would be of avoiding that, it's 40 hectares.
Okay, so have you taken any consideration of the fact that in the Martinborough overlay area, I think we'd struggle to find any viticulture that is of 40 hectares now. And by going to 40 hectares, we would be potentially restricting any further development, as opposed to what we're trying to do, which is enable development of that culture.
Yes, sir.
The exact opposite. So if it wasn't 40, and I know you think that if we go to 4, then it's going to be not used for viticulture and so on and so forth, and it might be subdivided down. And so what would be we need to give some thought as to what is actually going to achieve what we're trying to do in that overlay area.
Yes.
As opposed to restricting it and saying, well, that's it,
If we were to enable additional subdivision below 40, more than, say, a discretionary status, I would be suggesting that it would have to still have an ability to decline consent. So restricted discretionary may be an alternative with a minimum for the Martinborough stores. That hasn't been requested as of yet. But if there was a desire for that, there would have to be that ability to decline. I guess the risk is if even at 8 hectares, there could be an individual come in and put that into a very large lifestyle block, which is actually nearly the worst outcome, given it's too large to be desired for lifestyle, and it's not an appropriate land use for the area. So
Because we've got rules that 4 hectares, you've got to be less than 4 hectares to subdivide it down even smaller, right?
that's right.
So anything over 4 hectares largely protects that that idea that viticulture might be sort of in the 4 to 10 hectare size because it's more than 4 hectares. So could you, and we're going to hear from Mr. Adrian for lunch, obviously, and he's going to obviously give us some of his thoughts on this issue. So it might be useful to actually sort of see if we can actually perhaps get an agreement of what's a practical solution to make sure that we retain the very culture that Martinborough has developed. When we grew up, Martinborough didn't have any of this at all, and it has got this, and it's created this internationally renowned thing. If we go 40, we might well be destroying the very thing that is actually giving Martinborough its character and its potential for further growth.
Yes, I guess my response to that would remain that with a controlled activity status, that's where the risk is that the councils have to grant. So regardless of if it's unlikely, there's still a potential, and in my view, we can't allow for that. So it would have to be, as I say, restricted discretionary upwards, as that provides an ability for a case by case. So if somebody did come in and say, I want to put a 5 hectare lifestyle block in, that the council can say, no, that's inconsistent with the plan, and we're not going to grant that.
Sure.
Sorry.
I think there's a question here from Robin.
In relation specifically to Martinborough and the soil overlay there, and we're talking the 40 hectare, and I don't know all the parcel of land that's appropriate. How much of that is greater than 40, sort of like one title would be greater than 40 hectares? So I guess it's because a lot of it has already been developed and it would be smaller than the 40 hectare minimum anyway. I guess it'd be, I'm curious to know what we're actually talking about that's over that 40 hectares, and what are we talking about? Because if it's already under the 40 hectares, then potentially we're kind of creating a bit of a maelstrom out of nothing.
So it gets Mr. Horrell.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, that's something we've noted down. I think what we're looking for is some sort of inventory of the breakup of allotment sizes, overlay, which you may already have.
Yeah, I was trying to find it here, but no, I'll get back to you and provide that.
That would be really, really useful, because it may be that it's a really important discussion for us to have, but it may actually not be as pertinent if.
I think there's 2 parts to it. One is providing the information, and then the second part is the so what question. What does that mean in terms of the proposed rules? I mean, if there are very few, not many, if any, allotments over 40 hectares, doesn't that mean every development would need it as a discretionary activity?
So you're referring now to just the Martinborough soil?
Yeah, just that. And then the second issue is the one that Councillor Plummer identified, and I'd made some notes as you were speaking, that if your concern is about the lack of the ability council to decline a consent is restricted discretionary activity, a potential middle ground for a 4 hectare or above rule. How does that, and if it is, how does that deal with the issue of managing the future land use of the site, and particularly in trying to avoid a large lifestyle block establishing, which would be contrary to the purpose of the zone. So whilst that might seem a potential solution, it's not without its problems. And So, but that's not to say it's not a solution. So hear from Mr. Abraham on that after lunch, and then we might provide some directions as to where do we go to from there. But providing that inventory and your right of reply would be simple.
David, just, can I ask, so can we, within the plan, have different rules for the Martinborough overlays, given that it's viticulture, it doesn't require big parcels of land to make it income?
Yes, we could have specific rules that apply to Martinborough. I guess my point would be it still has to align with the overarching direction, and in particular the strategic direction of avoiding fragmentation.
Yeah, and I guess we'll have more knowledge on that when you find out what the part size of the land is now.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I ask one other
Yes.
question? Would you consider viticulture intensive,
Intensive, as in
an intensive farming activity?
Oh, yeah.
in terms of the defined term, no, it's not. Intensive primary production is a defined term. So no, it wouldn't be, unless it was occurring primarily within, need to have a look at the definition, but within indoor facilities, it wouldn't meet it in most accounts.
Just a couple of more substantive issues before you get on to legal submissions, and then your summaries of amendments made in your 42A and the amendments made based on recirculated evidence. Don't think you need to take us through those latter two matters, but can you just talk paragraphs 94 to 98?
Okay, so part 3, key issue 4, rural subdivision rules. So sub R4, subdivision of land less than 4 hectares. Ms. McWilliam for Adamson Shore has sought that less than 4 hectare rule is applied to all 3 districts rather than just South Wairarapa and Carterton. The reasons for this have previously been discussed. Ms. McWilliam has sought that the condition C of sub R41 is amended as shown below. This clarifies the intent of the clause to capture subdivision that was otherwise authorised by resource consent. So that would be properties that were granted resource consent but hadn't gone through the formal process of updating the record of title. I remain of the opinion that the rural lifestyle zone is an appropriate method for providing for lifestyle opportunities in the Masterton district. With regard to Ms. McWilliams' suggested change, I agree that the clause should clarify and capture subdivision that was authorised by resource consent but may not have been implemented. I've recommended changes to the clause to capture this.
Yeah. And the surplus dwelling rule.
Mr. Hooper for Colin and Helen Southey has noted the changes I've recommended to sub R5 and accepts this as an improvement. While this is accepted, Mr. Hooper considers that the changes could be made while retaining the overall controlled activity status. Mr. Hooper has also noted that matter of discretion A3 of sub R5 may be a typo. Ms. McWilliam of Adamson Shore has acknowledged the recommended changes and noted her support. The support of the changes is noted, and to confirm that matter of discretion was incorrectly included in the rule, and I've since updated to remove that.
Thank you, Mr. Horrell. There's been a couple of legal briefs submitted, Radio New Zealand and Greater Wellington. We've read those. Is there anything that you wanted to draw to our attention in relation to those 2 briefs?
So just the Radio New Zealand change, they had previously contacted me and talked through that issue, which in my section 42A, I'd noted that I thought that the change was actually going to limit themselves. They've since clarified that it is a fairly narrow issue. So I'm happy with the changes they've suggested.
Okay.
And then the Greater Wellington change, I did previously talk to that, which was controlled activity and the potential for contamination.
And the requirements in the land water plan.
That's right, yes.
Okay. Usually summarise the recommendations from the 42A and the ones arising from your summary. And 10 right through to 106. In that 108, you're dealing with a zoning matter that was inadvertently left off your 42A.
Mm.
Do you need to talk to that just so it's on the record?
Yes, so the Dublin Street wines, I talked to that previously, that was the property I'd missed off the map and I hadn't included the specific valuation. But to confirm that the general valuation remains consistent for that property. The NZTA had sought that minor residential dwellings do not apply to properties less than 40 hectares where it's not used for primary production. I had, in response, I don't think that's one enforceable or reasonable. I think it's still a fairly minor activity. NZTA had noted in their tabled Lisa that they accept that.
Okay. Then just finally, you've referenced that earlier this month, the Greater Wellington released their decisions on proposed plan change number 1 to the RPS. We were expecting that. We recorded that might happen in our minute following hearing stream 1. And we've actually directed some conferencing between Greater Wellington and certain submitters in the council in relation to some of the strategic direction provisions. You've only had a cursory look at the decisions. You're just wondering, well, you haven't come to a final conclusion, but you don't think they're that relevant to the rural topic is.
Yes, the plan change was largely directed at urban development, Indigenous biodiversity, freshwater and climate change. So there are some indirect references to the rural environment, but there's no specific direction that would be, or that I could see in my immediate review that would be immediately contact.
That's something you could address further in your right of reply.
Yes, I will. Yes.
And it may be that you're doing that, just have a view to whether from a fairness and natural justice point of view, whether changes that you might recommend need to be considered at perhaps an integration of wrap-up hearing following hearing 13. Hey, panel, is there any other pressing matters that are bothering us? No? We're sorry we've gone slightly over time, but not a bad effort. A considerable amount of material to get through. We will adjourn for lunch and we'll reconvene on the dot at 1:30. Good point.